Newsflash, liberals across the country, we do not live in a utopia. Because we do not live in a utopia, we require law enforcement, security, protection to keep us safe, to keep our children safe. That doesn't mean that at all times we're always safe and that there's enough law enforcement to keep everybody safe from every incident or every bad actor or every criminal act. And it also doesn't mean that you give law enforcement a pass when there has been a police abuse. And when you have seen in the George Floyd case most recently, you don't give law enforcement a pass. The question is, what is the correct response? And the radical groups that have been running the protests, which then led to riots, which have now kind of calmed down back into protest, they are now pushing something that I kind of feel like we've dealt with a lot before at the ACLJ when it comes to Israel. Let's just divest from the police. Let's defund the police. We don't need police. Now, let me ask you this. You want police in your neighborhood? You want police in your city? In your town? How would you feel like if Joe Biden started endorsing a message like this? And we're starting to see how elected Democrats, Dad, are trying to dance around this move, which is moving forward in places like Minneapolis.
Yep.
And they're starting the process there. Los Angeles pulling $150 million out of the police budget. That's not going to add to more training on appropriate police action. It's going to take away from appropriate training methods. But we're starting to see these Democrats say, well, it needs to look piece by piece, city by city. They're worried. They're scared, too, that if this becomes the defining message of 2020, instead of George Floyd and police brutality and something we need to deal with as a nation, that defunding the police is a very dangerous, first of all, it's very dangerous. And second, it is a losing, absolutely losing political kind of ideology.
No, I don't think there's any question about that, but just let me read to you what the council president of Minneapolis said. We're committed to dismantling the police as we know it in the city of Minneapolis and to rebuild with our community a new model of public safety that actually keep our community safe. They go on to say, when pressed for details about it, she said they really haven't worked through that yet, but they're going to start with funding. Obviously, they want to cut funding and more to a community-based strategy. Now, look, what happened with these police officers involved in this murder, and that's what I call it, is a crime. It should be prosecuted. It should be rooted out and gotten out of the police departments throughout the country. We should be in a situation where no citizen, and it is especially true within the African-American community, should be subjected and treated like these police officers treated. I mean, it's not just what happened in Minneapolis. It's been many other states. We've seen it over the history. That has to go. But the answer cannot be, it's so simplistic. Oh, we'll just dismantle the police department and then I was reading all these articles last night and then we'll come up with something that may work. What's that something? Well, they really don't know. Well, maybe you should have the idea of what that's going to be before you start dismantling public safety, because the primary job of local government is community safety and well-being. And I think they're making a serious mistake, a really serious mistake, Jordan, when they take this as the route. They were making a lot of statements and getting a lot of attention to that police brutality, which was good to get the attention. Then it was trying to be hijacked by a few. And then the real protesters took it back from the hijackers. Good. But now the move is to the political move. And what in my view, a tremendous mistake.
Folks, the ACLJ is doing work all across the country on all the issues that you care about, all across the world on the issues you care about. And we're able to broadcast it to you because of your support. We're able to do the work in our country because of your support. We're able to do the work internationally because of your financial support. No amount too small, no amount too big. It all makes a huge impact. Go to aclj.org and donate today.
We've handled a series of cases involving those that are being persecuted for their faith. They called it terrorism, but they actually use in the indictment itself the word Christianization.
There is this crackdown trying to stop Christian practice of their faith.
A goal that we have in a lot of these cases is to get the United States government to speak with one unified voice.
a principal comes and yanks your Bible away.
A teacher became aware that the student was reading from the Bible.
We're here standing for these kids and their families.
Prohibited from meeting with other Christians during recess.
We do have to fight against them when they occur. Otherwise, those abuses will win the day.
This is a fight that you're going to have to be engaged in. It's already a long-term struggle. It is not over.
We are so grateful to the people who prayed for us, and we are so grateful for ACLJ.
Folks, this is happening across the country as we speak, and so in LA, it's $150 million being taken out of the police department's budget. Same, very similar in New York, in the NYPD there, with significant amount of funding being taken out of their budget at a time when you think, with this brutality that we're dealing with, the horrendousness of what happened with George Floyd, the murder there, that police need a lot more training. And they need to go back through their old training books, like Minnesota had to do, and say, hey, let's get rid of the chokehold. You know, that was still on the books. The chokehold was still part of police tactics in Minneapolis until last week. So maybe we need to use those resources to go back through the training materials, retrain, especially those officers who are most commonly find themselves in conflict, street cops, if you will, and spend money that way. Instead, what do they want to do? Pay police officers less and provide them less training? Or, in some cases, just abolish them altogether, like in Minneapolis? But I want to go around and get everybody's reaction to this. First, Harry Hutchinson is joining us. Harry, your thoughts on this now growing movement, this cause celeb, which is gaining steam at the municipal level of government in states across the country to defund the police.
Jordan, the move to defund the police, which is growing, is also hugely paradoxical. This is so because defunding the police will leave our most vulnerable populations at risk. Consider a few facts. First, in 2018, there were 7,407 African-American homicide victims. Thus understood, Black victims of police shootings represent 0.1% of all African-Americans killed in 2019. By contrast, a police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by an African-American male than an unarmed Black male. So if you pull back the police, guess what? You leave the most vulnerable populations at risk. The most vulnerable populations largely consist of members of minority groups. We have already seen this in Chicago, Baltimore, and elsewhere, and it has resulted in the added deaths of over 1,000 African Americans as the police pulled back. So we have a natural experiment already ongoing, and so if Minneapolis goes down this road, we should see housing prices fall, we should see murder rates go up, and we should see criminals move to Minneapolis because the rate of return on their investment in crime will likely rise.
I mean, who on earth would want to live in a neighborhood and would choose to live in a neighborhood that, by the way, we have no police here. We'll have this community program and I guess neighborhood watch, rely all on that. Nobody who could make that choice would do that. The problem is that a lot of the people who live in these communities don't have that choice to make economically. They're stuck there right now. And so they're going to be stuck being this experiment in outrageously extreme leftist, anti-police, we can live in a utopia. I mean, come on. Let's just read the room, see the world right now. The world is protesting. There's police brutality. We have COVID-19, and yet now we want to abolish police in the worst neighborhoods in the country, by the way, in the toughest places. I mean, this is, to me, this is how Joe Biden ends up losing in 2020 before he even gets started.
We have the ability, because of the depth of our team, to give you some real experience on this. And I want to go to Andy Economo, who is a senior counsel, of course, at the ACLJ, a former United States attorney, also served as a state's attorney general in the state's attorney general's office, and as a assistant district attorney. So he's had the experience across the board dealing with law enforcement, and has had the unique experience of both defending police, but also indicting them. So Andy comes to this with a complete package of understanding. So let me start with the first question, Andy, which is, and what happened in Minneapolis was outrageous. It's a crime. It's murder. I think they're having it as second degree. I don't know the intricacies of the law there. I would have thought it would have been murder one, but maybe they didn't think there was enough premeditation. Putting that aside, you've dealt with these situations. Let's talk about how you deal with a situation where police officers violate the law while they're on duty doing an arrest.
Well, the way you do that is you prosecute them. That's how you do it. And I have seen that, and I have done that, in point of fact, in communities in South Georgia and in North Georgia, when we have prosecuted police officers who use excessive force and brutality in effecting arrests and enforcing the law. But the answer is training and instruction to these police officers. And as Jordan pointed out, the chokehold still on the books in Minneapolis Police Department. What an absurd thing that has been removed from most law enforcement agencies. But the answer is not to take the police force and to disband it and glue together a vigilante force subsequent to that to protect them. And I think Professor Hutchison's remarks are really telling. The most vulnerable are the minority and black communities, the poor Hispanic communities among us where there is rampant crime. Who are you going to call when your house is being burglarized? Who are you going to call when you're being assaulted with a weapon? Who are you going to call when your house and your children are being sexually molested and hurt? Are you going to call a protester and to come and to save you? No, you call the police departments, because these are the least of these who need the protection more than those in the other communities where there is no crime. I have seen it from both sides, defending police and prosecuting police who have been overly exuberant in their enforcement of the law, Jay. And the answer is not to defund police departments, because that calls the fringes of the left and the radical slogans out more and more and more, and doesn't do anything to protect the country.
I mean, in a city that can barely get itself off the ground, New York City, hard to say that even, but in a city that is supposed to be reopening today, though the streets look pretty darn empty when you see places that are usually packed like Times Square. This was Mayor Bill de Blasio's message to the public. Take a listen.
Based on the suggestions of the caucus, based on the work of the task force, that we will be moving funding from the NYPD to youth initiatives and social services.
At a time when the NYPD, Dad, is under probably the greatest rate it's been in since 9/11, and they're dealing with, still, even though the riots have calmed down, just a city which can't even get itself back off the ground yet, boarded up, burned down, and that's just what we've seen in the news. Office buildings that are empty and trying to reopen. And yet he's trying to reopen this massive city, and the first step he's going to take is take some money away from the police.
Yeah, I mean, you think about this for a moment. I mean, it's not only does not make sense, which of course it does not make sense, but what does it do to the populace? And that's why I want to talk to Harry about this, because he lived in Detroit, in the Detroit area. He knows the situation there. And what I'm trying to figure out, and this is what it's perplexing me, they've obviously decided to make a political shift. You went from peaceful protests to then some rebel rousers came in trying to disrupt those peaceful protests. Fortunately, the peaceful protesters basically themselves, with the police, of course, stopped that because it was stealing the moment. Then they went back to peaceful protests, which, as everybody knows, I've defended before the Supreme Court of the United States for 4 decades now. So I've defended civil disobedience. I've defended free speech. I don't defend people that take, Molotov cocktails through windows of stores. That's called a crime. Civil disobedience is a crime too, but it's a different level of issue. But here's what I wanted to go with, Harry. Let's talk about this from a policy perspective. You want to have police reform because there's obviously a real problem. But why do you start with the money and defunding the police instead of figuring out how to make it a better situation?
Well, I think the answer, Jay, is because of pure politics. I think some individuals have engaged in a political calculus that the way to power is to claim support for a particular narrative. And that narrative, at least in part, is the claim that there is systematic or systemic police racism. On the other hand, other observers see little evidence of bias, or at least bias that justifies substantive reform that could include changing America's approach to policing that has left more than 1,000 Americans fatally shot by law enforcement. So we need first to look at the facts, and second, we need to emphasize the vulnerable populations who will be at risk without police.
Folks, the ACLJ is doing work all across the country on all the issues that you care about, all across the world on the issues you care about. And we're able to broadcast it to you because of your support. We're able to do the work in our country because of your support. We're able to do the work internationally because of your financial support. No amount too small, no amount too big. It all makes a huge impact. Go to aclj.org and donate today.
We've handled a series of cases involving those that are being persecuted for their faith. They called it terrorism, but they actually use in the indictment itself the word Christianization.
There is this crackdown trying to stop Christian practice of their faith.
A goal that we have in a lot of these cases is to get the United States government to speak with one unified voice.
A principal comes and yanks your Bible away.
A teacher became aware that the student was reading from the Bible.
We're here standing for these kids and their families.
Prohibited from meeting with other Christians during recess.
We do have to fight against them when they occur, otherwise those abuses will win the day.
This is a fight that you're going to have to be engaged in. It's already a long-term struggle. It is not over.
We are so grateful to the people who prayed for us, and we are so grateful for ACLJ.
You would laugh if it wasn't so scary. I was just reading through about, here's some of the ideas they have to abolish the police in some areas like New York. So no more traffic stops, which, there's various reasons to do that. For instance, if it's a stolen vehicle, suspected drugs,
suspected terrorism,
suspected speeding. Okay, so just using these terms. Street outreach teams replacing police. So vigilante justice. People who get to make up their mind about who is bad and who is not. And if you believe Joe Biden, that's very scary because 50 million Americans are very bad people. So, I don't know if I want that to be done. It goes even further, though. Sex workers unionized. Get this one, Dad. I would love to get Dad, Harry, and Andy's comment on this.
Take some calls, though, too.
Burglaries resolved by restorative justice.
Yeah, I'll tell you what that means. Don't prosecute. Say, would you give us the documents back? Would you give us the jewelry that you stole back? Would you give us the money you took from us back, please? Because that way we can avoid the court costs. Let's go quickly on this because I want to get to calls. Andy, your reaction to restorative justice?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. When you have a bank robber and he comes in and he pulls a gun and he robs the bank of $50,000, we don't prosecute him. We don't have a police officer there. We don't try to take him into custody. We say, I'll tell you what. We will forget all about the bank robbery, the danger that you put the tellers in, the danger that you put the bank personnel in. Just give the money back and we'll let you go to the next bank. That's how ridiculous a system like that would be. I had a bank robber once, and he actually, through his lawyer, said, "If we give the money back, will you forget it?" And I said, "Are you crazy?"
Harry?
Well, I think Andy is absolutely correct. All this proposal would do in terms of defunding the police and let's call it the restorative justice, basically all we are doing is we are incentivizing more crime, particularly, as I said earlier, in vulnerable areas. And so if you live in Beverly Hills, if you live in the northwest part of Washington, D.C., and you're surrounded by security teams like former President Obama, this is absolutely wonderful as a thought experiment. But the reality is quite different.
Let's Jordan, let's go ahead and take Jamie's call. He's been holding for a long time.
Hey, Jamie in Oklahoma, line 1. Jamie, thanks for holding. You're on the air.
Hi, guys. Appreciate all you do.
Thank you.
I have a kind of a double whammy here. I had an experience with a police officer. My son had been transferred back to Oklahoma with his company, and he had been working extremely long hours. And so he was using my vehicle. And I got a call at like 1 a.m, and it was him, and he was not very far away, and he had dozed and hit a tree. You know, he wasn't going fast because, you know, he was still alive, but he was barely hurt. So I go down there and I start talking to the policeman, and this policeman literally jumped on me, telling me to shut up, that if I didn't shut up, that he was going to put me in cuffs and take me to jail. So I turned around and I said, I'd like to speak with your supervisor. And he was nose to nose with me. And the other police officers told him, he said, man, back off.
Well, I've had not that experience, but I've had, there's been some odd ones, I would say. I'm going to go to Andy on this, but I've had some odd ones. But I'm never disrespectful back to the officer. If the officer says, the problem is what these officers have done in these black communities, now again, not all of them, not most of them, but enough that it's causing a problem, is the belligerence from the officer. They have to you could be very respectful, even in a situation that's highly charged. And that's where the training of these police officers and consequences if they violate it, Andy, have to come in. And you've taken those cases.
Yes, that's exactly right. Consequences and training. Look, I'm not for defunding the police. I am for quadrupling the budgets of the police and using that money to train them in situations such as the one that the caller mentioned. You don't get in somebody's face. You're always polite and courteous. And the other officers she mentioned said, hey, back off, and that is the correct reaction. But it's training, teaching people how to react in situations that are potentially volatile. And that's what we need to do, not abolish and do away with the police and have private security forces at each person's house, but train them how to react to volatile situations and teach them how to react instead of putting a knee on somebody's neck, and when they're gasping for breath and saying, let me go, you ought to let them go. But those are the kinds of things. There's going to be bad apples in any organization, Jay. I've seen this in police departments throughout the state where I practice law, but that is the minority. It really is. It is not the majority of people in law enforcement.
Jordan, let's take Jason's call.
Yeah, Jason, Oregon, on line 3. Jason, thanks for holding on. You're on the air.
Hey, so did they even consider what would happen when 911 calls and the EMTs and the paramedics need that police covering on a hot spot or a heated situation? They're going to send them in vulnerable. I mean, what do they think when something like that's going to happen?
Well, I mean, I think this is the biggest concern. If you actually enacted something like Minneapolis is doing, what about all those services that also we pay for with our taxpayer dollars to use in emergency services, whether it's the ambulances, EMS, fire departments? Dad, they rely on police. Yep. Everyone knows that. Who's first there? It's the fire trucks with the police. It's the police with the ambulance. They are there to protect those who are performing those emergency duties, but also in case things get out of control.
Exactly right. I wanted to go to Harry on this because I want to close with this. And that's the impact that this, Harry, I always want to look at the empirical data. What's the evidence going to show? Where does this go? What is the impact on a move like this in Minneapolis? What is the impact of that on the communities there?
Well, I think the impact is likely to be more fragmentation, more separation, perhaps even less support for law and order. And most poignantly, we are likely to see, sadly, a rise in domestic violence. And so if you look at the data, you will find, for instance, that when there is a shooting involving police officers or citizens, often it comes out of domestic violence situations. So, for instance, you have a spouse who's engaged in domestic violence. Who do they call in Minneapolis? Who's there to protect the individual that's vulnerable, which sometimes includes children? And so I think one of the sad things about Minneapolis and some of these other efforts is there is no thinking involved.
Folks, the ACLJ is doing work all across the country on all the issues that you care about, all across the world on the issues you care about. And we're able to broadcast it to you because of your support. We're able to do the work in our country because of your support. We're able to do the work internationally because of your financial support. No amount too small, no amount too big. It all makes a huge impact. Go to aclj.org and donate today.
We've handled a series of cases involving those that are being persecuted for their faith. They called it terrorism, but they actually use in the indictment itself the word Christianization.
There is this crackdown trying to stop Christian practice of their faith.
A goal that we have in a lot of these cases is to get the United States government to speak with one unified voice.
A principal comes and yanks your Bible away.
A teacher became aware that the student was reading from the Bible.
We're here standing for these kids and their families.
Prohibited from meeting with other Christians during recess.
We do have to fight against them when they occur, otherwise those abuses will win the day.
This is a fight that you're going to have to be engaged in. It's already a long-term struggle. It is not over.
We are so grateful to the people who prayed for us, and we are so grateful for ACLJ.